happy to welcome for the second time David Angelis. This week we're looking at basically David's real passion, and that is the reptiles and frogs. And how can you not like sort of reptiles and frogs, really? They're just, they may not be furry, but they're still pretty cute. One of the things I'd have to confess to is being a little bit of a indigenous species fascist, and insisting that what we need in our environments is indigenous species and more indigenous species in order to encourage our local species to thrive. And David is going to disabuse me of some of that, at least, and point out that there are many local species that are quite happy to take advantage of non-indigenous species. So the importance is understanding the requirements of the species more than obsessing about the particular environments that we build for them. And I suppose I have to confess that we have in our extensive garden the odd non-indigenous species, and quite clearly observed that local species making pretty good use of them. So I really can't be too sort of overly, I said fascist, that's probably a bit strong, but overly precious about the indigenous species. So again, thank you for your work on this, David. David is an ecologist and is a zoologist and an ecological consultant with a background in land management, particularly interested in the conservation and ecology of reptiles and frogs, having surveyed and written management plans for several species in southern Victoria, including, and I quote, the Swamp Skink, the Glossy Grass Skink, striped Legless Lizard, Tussock Skink, southern Toadlet, and Growling grass frog, all of which I'm sure you'll all be familiar with. Seriously though, David, thanks for your talk tonight, and I'm looking forward to it because I just happened to turn off one of our water features and found the next couple of days it was full of eggs from somebody or other, probably the old brown tree frog, but yeah. We'll see what turns up later.
Great. Yeah, very good. No worries. Thank you very much, Paul, and thanks to you and Anthony again for inviting me back to speak tonight about what you said is really a passion of mine. I'll bring up the presentation now.
Sorry, David.
Yep.
Just one more thing. I know I can see a lot of people have turned off their mutes, and thank you very much for that. But just in case there's anyone down there that hasn't already turned off their mute and possibly their video, it helps a lot with the streaming. Thanks to our former Prime Minister when he was communications officer, the wonderful NBN we have. It helps the bandwidth if people switch things off. So sorry, David.
Yeah, no worries. No, good advice. Okay, so I'll just check with Anthony. Hopefully my presentation can be seen, or do I need to reshare?
I just reshare. Thanks, Dave.
Yep. So it's visible now. Yep. Oh, hopefully.
Not just yet.
Not just yet.
No, it still has not come up.
Do I need to do something, Anthony?
No, you shouldn't need to. Paul. Dave, just stop sharing.
Reshare. Yeah. Yep. Hang on. Okay.
Perfect. That's come up now.
Excellent. Okay. Famous last words. Nothing can possibly go wrong. Hopefully not. All right. Thanks again, Paul and Anthony, very much for inviting me along again tonight, as I said. So this really combines two passions of mine, or for want of a better word, obsession, in being land management, ecological, well, restoration, recovery, whatever term you'd like to use, and herpetology, reptiles and amphibians, and looking at combining the two, although it's often a tricky thing. I note that was a great introduction that you gave, Paul, about the mission and the aims, the objectives of the Victorian Environment Friends Network, particularly the protection of special places and native species, which is really what tonight's talk's about, albeit focused on the reptiles and frogs. And also appropriate that yesterday was Threatened Species Day. So Paul read out a list of threatened reptiles, mostly occurring around the Melbourne area, but a lot of them extend far beyond, in other parts of the state, and across borders. So hopefully, no matter where people are listening in from tonight, there'll be information in this presentation that's just as relevant to the areas that they're working in, even though the focus is on southern Victoria, and a lot of the case studies and examples that I'll show are focused on the Melbourne area. Okay, so I should probably mention at this stage, I'm not an academic by any means myself, at least not in professional sense, although I dabble around the edges, and through my role as an ecological consultant and in education at La Trobe University's Wildlife Sanctuary, I'm involved in a few projects relating to habitat management for threatened species, and frogs and reptiles in particular. We'll get through the slightly depressing side of things first. So I should also give a warning that the presentation's a little bit graph heavy. I've tried to balance it out with plenty of pictures as well, but I'll try and move through the data and the information as quickly and simply as I can. And there's nothing in there that's hopefully too complex that people struggle to understand, but I'll guide us through it. So reptiles, in terms of how they're doing relative to other groups of native animals in the state, looking at the raw data, you'd possibly say that they're not necessarily doing the worst. In raw numbers, there are more species of threatened bird in the state than what there are reptiles, for example. Amphibians, they're at the bottom of the list in terms of the raw number of species that are threatened in the state. But this is when you look at the raw numbers. However, when you compare the proportion that are threatened relative to the number of species of birds versus reptiles versus amphibians in Victoria, we've got a higher proportion of reptiles and amphibians that are threatened, those groups on their own, compared to the birds on their own or the mammals on their own. But to be fair, the fish are in an even worse position, with the highest proportion of species rare or threatened in the state compared to the number of species that are here. So yes, there's a bias toward the cold-blooded animals tending to have a higher proportion of threatened species than what the warm-blooded birds or mammals do. Some of that, at least as far as the reptiles are concerned, and amphibians and fish, there are a lot of cryptic species. They're, in many cases, not necessarily as easy to study as what birds all mammals are, let alone to survey for and get a clear idea of their status and abundance. But as you can probably guess, reptiles don't necessarily get the best reputation. Some people have a bit of an aversion to reptiles, maybe less of an issue with frogs. For the amphibians, and so in Victoria, that's really only referring to frogs, although we have one other amphibian, a newt, which is introduced and thankfully fairly restricted in terms of where it currently occurs. But all of our native amphibians are frogs. And one of the biggest issues for that group, as I'll explain further, is disease, and in particular fungus, chytrid fungus. And I'll explain a little bit more about that when we get to talking about the growling grass frog. Okay, in terms of what sort of threats are important, in this case out of the recently published new action plan, but only looking at the lizards and snakes, which make up the bulk of the reptiles that we have in Victoria, as you'd expect. But it gives you a bit of an idea of the threats that are acting on, well, not only lizards and snakes, but a lot of these obviously are applicable to some of the other reptiles, turtles, etc. And some of them frogs. So for example, the two biggest factors are habitat loss and impacts from livestock are pretty much applicable across other groups as well. And as far as lizards and snakes are concerned, the highest contributors to their rare and threatened status. Fire, and particularly more recently, has become a bigger issue and more recognised, and particularly relevant at the moment, given what occurred in East Gippsland earlier in the year. It's an interesting one though, because certainly an increase in the intensity and frequency of fires can pose a threat to reptiles, frogs as well. But a change in fire regime, and in some cases, a lack of fire in certain habitats and landscapes can be just as much as a threat for some reptiles as increase in fire frequency or intensity. And I'll explain a little bit more about that when we get to some specific case studies. Okay, so before we launch into that, Nick Kleeman, who some of you might be familiar with, works for our Department of Environment in the department's environmental research arm, the Arthur Ryler Institute, as a senior scientist. But his specific area of expertise are the frogs and reptiles. Nick's a bit of a bulldog in this area as far as frog and reptile conservation goes, which I think's needed in some cases, and it's a good thing. He's an activist, which is difficult for him in the position that he's in as a public servant, but nevertheless does a brilliant job with raising all sorts of issues related to conservation of reptiles and frogs, and he covers a lot of those in this paper that he published a few years ago. But in particular, we're going to pick out one of the things that Nick commented on, and that's poor advice and planning information to inform management and prevent the further degradation of habitat. Okay, and the first one that we'll start with, the growling grass frog. So I'll run through a selection of species, the ones that I've become more familiar with through my work and study. It's going to be a bit heavy on the growling grass frog for the initial part of this presentation, but we'll move on to some of the others later on. The reason being, a lot of the work that's happened on growling grass frogs been undertaken by Jeff Hurd, who's probably won't mind me referring to him as the growling grass frog guru, because he's been studying them for a long time and did his PhD on them, which is where this data comes from. So we've got a lot of information on growling grass frog compared to, well, not only other threatened frogs, but some of the threatened reptiles in the Melbourne area. The ones that I'm showing you, though, the information that I'm presenting obviously are the ones that have a bit more that's known about them in terms of their habitat preference and threats, and what we might be able to do to help them along. So, as you might not expect, in the initial stages of Jeff's PhD, he looked at what microhabitats are important for growling grass frog. Terrestrial microhabitats, so they'll forage on land and they'll overwinter on land when they're not active and breeding in the warmer time of year, and seek shelter. And Jeff found that, contrary to what you might think, growling grass frogs are most often encountered on rocks and bare ground when they're outside of the water. You might think, well, that makes sense because they're more obvious. You're more likely to see them when they're on bare ground or when they're on rocks versus when they're in thicker vegetation. So does it necessarily mean that bare rock and bare ground are important microhabitats for the growling grass frog when they're on land? Or really, should we be emphasising, planting around the wetland thickly when we're revegetating? Jeff accounted for that in his data. They were aware of that bias, and so made a particular effort to thoroughly survey in thicker vegetation, which wasn't entirely foolproof, but enough to mean that the data is largely good, so far as suggesting that there is a genuine relationship between bare ground and rock around a wetland, and those being important microhabitats for the growling grass frog, which, hearing that at first, doesn't make sense. But there are a couple of reasons for that that only became apparent later on in Jeff's work. And we'll talk about that a bit more. But before we do, I'll quickly mention so we've got an idea of what their requirements are on land, but what about in the water? What about their breeding habitat? So Jeff came up with a fairly neat diagram showing increasing suitability of aquatic habitat for growling grass frog. And all that it really shows is that with an increase in macrophytes in aquatic plants, but particularly submerged plants. Floating plants as well, but a much lesser proportion of floating plants. So in general, ideally leaving half the water surface or even more than that, clear, free of vegetation to allow more sun into the water, which is particularly important for the growling grass frog. But it's important for a lot of other pond breeding frogs as well, for the development of their tadpoles. There's another reason why allowing more sunlight into particularly growling grass frog habitat's important. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. But the key point from this is you can almost never have too many submergent plants. The more submerged aquatic plants that you have in growling grass frog habitat, let alone necessarily aquatic habitat for any of our other local frogs, the better it is. They're sites for egg deposition, and they provide a foraging resource. The scum, the film on the leaves of aquatic plants, as well as rocks and submerged logs, tend to be where tadpoles like to forage. But also, obviously, protection for tadpoles. And in the case of the growling grass frog, adults often sit in the water when they're not on land. They are largely aquatic frog, even though they are truly amphibious like all of our local frogs, but they're more aquatic in their lifestyle than most of our other local frogs. And they'll duck underneath submerged vegetation to hide from predators or when they feel threatened. Okay, so now we're getting to the really interesting but hard to get your head around concept. This came about later in Jeff's work, and all that it's really showing, these nice modelled line, is that with increasing water temperature, the probability of growling grass frogs getting infected with chytrid fungus goes down because it's a cool climate fungus. So it said maybe in the sort of mid to low 20s, 22 degrees and above, chytrid fungus doesn't tend to do so well. It's an aquatic fungus, it's microscopic. For those of you who aren't so familiar with it, it attacks keratin. The frog's skin's made up mostly of keratin. So it's a horrible disease for an animal that, I mean, we rely on our skin, but it's arguably even more important for amphibians because a percentage of their oxygen intake transfer happens through their skin. Although they breathe as we do, they've got lungs, but it helps to maintain their water balance. And so those then become issues for these frogs when they're infected by chytrid fungus, which attacks and degrades the skin and leaves them susceptible to secondary infections and all sorts of other horrible outcomes. But the one on the right shows that, so not only with increasing temperature is a likelihood of growling grass frogs being infected with chytrid less, but the same is true with more highly saline wetlands. The more highly saline a wetland is within limits, the less likely growling grass frogs are to be infected by chytrid fungus. It's not often that salinity is considered a beneficial thing in the environment, but this now looks to be a rare example of that. But as I said, within limits. So how much are we talking? And so one of the things that Jeff was able to figure out is around 3,000 parts per million, a bit more than that, between 3,400 parts per million. So in the mid-range of bore water, if you like, and what you can safely give to livestock, or at the very least, dry livestock that aren't lactating. So an interesting chemical refuge situation for the growling grass frog based on Jeff's data. And even more incredible to get your head around, this was some work done on a closely related species, a sister species of the growling grass frog, the green and golden bell frog, which also occurs in eastern Victoria, far eastern Victoria, but up the New South Wales coast. Brian Kearney, who was a PhD student at the time at Monash Uni, looked at the salinity tolerance of the tadpoles of the green and golden bell frog compared to a couple of our local frogs that we have in Melbourne, spotted marsh frog and common spadefoot toad. What he found for those other species is that, as you might expect, tadpole survivorship decreases with an increase in salinity, which kind of makes sense. We know vast majority of frogs as being truly, freshwater animals, at least for the part of their life cycle as a tadpole when they're in the water. For most, well, for many species anyway. He found exactly the opposite for the green and golden bell frog. Tadpole survivorship increased with an increase in salinity. And again, there are limits, but why would it show a complete reversal in that relationship between survivorship and salinity compared to some of our local frogs? We know that at least spotted marsh frog isn't as susceptible to chytrid fungus. It has some resistance, and the thought is that it's possibly because they produce peptides, so chemicals in their skin that inhibit the fungus. Growling grass frog, well, in this case, green and golden bell frog, it's not necessarily that tadpoles had a higher survivorship because they were infected with chytrid. That probably wouldn't have made any other difference because they're just as sensitive to salinity, you could assume, when they're infected with chytrid versus when they're not. But what could be true, and it's an area that needs more investigation, is that the tadpoles that Brian used in his experiment, the founding population, so when the animals were originally sourced in the wild, and then the tadpoles that Brian used were captive bred, those wild animals were adapted to living in more highly saline environments. And why would that be? Possibly because chytrid acts as a strong driver, adaptive driver. It selects for frogs that are more highly saline tolerant. So the frogs that aren't, they're more susceptible to the fungus, and they die off. The fungus kills them off, but it can't, at least as much, get to or infect the frogs that are in more highly saline environments. So the hypothesis, at least, is that chytrid might have driven them to become adapted to more highly saline wetlands. Okay, we're almost at the end of growling grass frog, but the important thing to take away from Jeff's diagram in one of his more recently published papers is that emergent vegetation cover, so taller vegetation extending from the water, usually around the edge of a wetland, and tree and shrub cover around a wetland, both have negative effects on the water temperature because of the shading that they produce. And a decrease in water temperature, as I mentioned, has consequences for the prevalence of chytrid fungus and for growling grass frog. So shading vegetation, potentially reducing the water temperature, favours chytrid fungus and reduces the suitability or probability of growling grass frogs surviving or persisting in that wetland. And salinity, as we explained, has a negative impact on chytrid fungus. So it stands to reason that bizarrely, it's the open, exposed, hot wetlands and more highly saline wetlands, again within limits, that are providing refuges for the growling grass frog. And this is an example, a completely constructed man-made system to the west of Melbourne, largely concrete lined. This is, you know, if you didn't know that growling grass frogs were here, you'd probably write this place off. And yet there's an important breeding population of growling grass frogs in this lake, and they're mostly hanging around. So in some cases, emergent vegetation, when that's all that there is, growling grass frogs will use it. And so they're breeding in the clumps of rushes and reeds that are being planted in spots discreetly around the edges of the lake, and perching on the concrete ledge on the side. So not something that you'd necessarily consider ideal habitat for a threatened species like the growling grass frog, if you didn't know why it might be the case that they're doing better in this sort of environment than in many natural wetlands, or wetlands that are approaching a natural state. Okay, and the last little bit that we'll mention on the growler is that, as Paul hinted to, and I have, I can, if it makes any difference, I'm, for want of a better word, a bit of a plant fascist myself, coming from an albeit short background in land management and vegetation management. And I'd prefer native plants in the landscape as well, but the frogs don't really care. So this is a growling grass frog on an agapanthus, photographed in New Zealand, where both of those species are introduced. But our growling grass frogs, where they're meant to be here in Victoria, don't necessarily care what sort of plants they sit on, as long as the structure's right. So in the case of agapanthus, big strappy leaves. We don't want to promote the planting of more agapanthus. It's an environmental weed in Victoria, and it has impacts for other biodiversity. But there are indigenous plants that provide a similar structure that we should be promoting as substitutes. Okay, so one of the other couple of frogs that I'll mention and run through a bit more quickly, toadlets, very different to the growling grass frog in that they're laying their eggs terrestrially on land in shallow depressions and pools that flood seasonally. They're autumn breeders, at least in this part of the world. And the brown toadlet is considered endangered in Victoria. Not totally sure how they interact with that chytrid fungus, but there's another factor that affects them, which I'll talk about. But in this case, brown toadlets that we found at a site fairly recently with the Malmesbury and District Landcare Group, after searching the northern end of the Wombat State Forest for 3 nights and not finding this frog in ideal habitat that we thought we might have a chance of finding it. And lo and behold, it turns up on the side of the gravel road where we parked the cars on the second night of survey, in a former pine plantation that's gradually becoming further invaded with gorse, which is a noxious weed legislated to be controlled. So in this case, the frogs don't necessarily mind that. If anything, it might be providing them with a little bit of protection. As the gorse increases in cover though, it can become a potential issue for the frog as well, as I'll explain. They may have a slight preference toward more open vegetation structure, at least overhead, and thicker cover on the ground where they're laying their eggs and they're breeding. But in this case, carefully considered control of the gorse. So you'd be looking at cutting and painting, which would have a minimal impact on the frogs. And when the site's not inundated, so in this state, there'd be tadpoles in the water, but you're looking at spring and summer for the weed control, so that you don't risk contamination with herbicide. Okay, very closely related species, so much that brown toadlet and the southern toadlet hybridise. So similar habitat preferences, but this dendrogram, although it looks complicated, tells a pretty neat story. This comes from one of my colleagues, Brad Jenner, who did his diploma project on habitat preferences or selection by southern toadlets, specific to their breeding habitat, and found that they're really not fussy about what the type of plants are in terms of where they locate their breeding sites. So we've got a whole lot of different ecological vegetation classes or types indicated by the different symbols and colours down the bottom axis, and each one of those points from which a line extends represents an individual toadlet breeding site. And the higher the branching in this cluster analysis, so the higher the nodes are where they branch off, the more different those toadlet breeding sites are in terms of their floristics, the plant species that are there. So as you'd expect, different vegetation classes are fairly different in terms of the species that are in them. And the toadlets don't really care. They're more or less evenly spread across all the different ecological vegetation classes or types. However, they're selecting, particularly in the more closed habitats, so places like swamp scrub, dominated by tea tree that can become very thick overhead in the canopy, and sedge wetland. The toadlets are tending toward breeding sites that are more open, that have less, or that are less heavily covered in vegetation within those vegetation types. And maybe no real trend, or slightly the opposite, true of more open habitat types, vegetation classes like woodland. The toadlets, if anything, may be selecting slightly more heavily vegetated breeding sites within those more open habitats. But if anything, a weaker relationship, whereas there's a strong preference towards more open ground for, when they're selecting their breeding sites in vegetation that tends to be denser at the broader habitat scale or vegetation type. But there's another factor influencing the breeding success of southern toadlet, and it's one that probably impacts the brown toadlet as well, and that's currently the subject of a PhD at Deakin Uni, and that is hydro period, rain. So I mentioned that these toadlets breed in seasonally flooded depressions or small pools or wetlands. The only problem with that being that they take a relatively long time to complete their development from when they've hatched. So from hatching, it takes them 6, 7, maybe up to 8 months, 7 on average, give or take, to turn into an adult frog. And if the wetland, the seasonal wetland that they're breeding in, or that temporary depression dries up before then, the tadpoles die. And their breeding that year obviously won't be successful. And this has been the case historically. So even if there's enough rain earlier on in the season to get the eggs to hatch, if the rainfall drops off, later in the year, towards October, November is when they're tending to come out of the water. Obviously, if those habitats are drying up before then the frogs won't necessarily make it. And this is what tended to occur during the Millennium Drought. And subsequent to the drought breaking in 2010, in some cases at least that we know of, breeding was successful and the tadpoles were able to complete their development, turn into adult frogs and get out of there before the water dried up. And this is exactly what happened in one isolated population along the Mullum Creek in the eastern suburbs. So in 2009, before the Millennium Drought ended or broke, it was a reduction in rainfall in October that caused the tadpoles to perish. Whereas in the following year, 2010 was a successful breeding for this population, and they made it through to their emergence in November. And we're able to keep this population ticking over. Fortunately for southern toadlet, so I should acknowledge Craig Cleland, who can rightfully be considered the authority on this species. Craig, from some of his mark recapture data of toadlets in Hillsville, found that they can live in the wild for at least 10 years, which is just as well, because it means that if there's a drought year or even a few drought years together, they can potentially skip breeding in those years, assuming that they're still able to breed at an older age. And we know that these frogs in captivity can live for a bit longer than that even approaching 20 years for some toadlet species. Okay, now on to the scaly things. So, striped legless lizard. This is a particular site to the west of Melbourne that we didn't necessarily expect to find striped legless lizard for a couple of reasons. So this species is a grassland specialist. It's nationally vulnerable or threatened. And so in Victoria, grasslands, also through central, northern and northeast Victoria, Yea, Broadford, and north of there, they're in Canberra. They're on the plains of southern New South Wales. In Melbourne, mostly limited to the volcanic plain. But even then, they prefer a tussock structure and a bit of an open tussock structure with intertussock spacing or gaps so that they can bask. This particular site had recently been burnt. Before it was burnt, Council's land management contractor planted a bunch of river red gums to revegetate this site. However, once we found that there were striped legless lizards there was a change in tact and council agreed that the tree should be removed, which on the face of it might seem heartbreaking, removing revegetation. But in all honesty, we were more heartbroken when we saw the trees there, because we knew that striped legless lizard wouldn't be able to persist at this site once those trees matured. And that's because this species, being a true grassland specialist, it's not unfair to say that it has an aversion to overshading woody vegetation, whether they're trees or shrubs. And so it might not look as pretty without the trees there, but it means the difference between striped legless lizard persisting at this site or not. And given that it's a threatened species, and the highest, arguably the highest ecological value at this particular site. It became the priority for management, and so the trees were removed for the protection of the lizard. And they're not necessarily, again, that fussy about what sort of grass they're living in. So I should say as well that historically, of course, there were trees amongst grassland, and river red gum's not an inappropriate tree to be growing amongst grassland on the Western Plains. But legless lizards are in the matrix, in the grassland matrix between the trees, not necessarily too close or underneath them. But they're not that fussy about what the grass is. So typically they like things like kangaroo grass, which have a good tussock structure to them, but they'll just as happily, for better or worse, use things like serrated tussock, which also have a really good tussock structure to it, but it's a weed of national significance and legislated as a prohibited or controlled weed, depending on where in Victoria you are. But the legless lizards aren't discriminating between that and native grasses necessarily, and just as happily use Chilean needle grass, which is another noxious species and highly invasive species. So some real difficulties there for land managers. What influences where striped lizards, legless lizards occur in this habitat is more dependent on historic disturbance and the regularity of continuing disturbances like fire and grazing and mowing.
It goes till 8:30.
Okay. Another grassland specialist, the Tussock Skink, shares a similar story, but it's a little bit better able to recolonise habitats. So this is an example of an area that was partially ploughed. A lot of the surface rock had been removed, but as far as we figured, Tussock Skink had recolonised from a nearby area, supporting more intact grassland. And there's a pile of rubble, including some rocks, in the middle of this site, which is where we found a small population of these skinks, including a pregnant female, which suggests that they're not only able to recolonise sites like this, but successfully recruit there as well. So I say maintaining habitats for threatened grassland reptiles, plural, because Michael Scroggy, who did this work, or the analysis of it anyway, found a similar pattern for the Tussock Skink as he did for the legless lizard, which is that the strategic use of fire and grazing to manage grassland habitat can be beneficial for striped legless lizard populations, but intense or concurrent application of both disturbances, so grazing and fire together, can lead to the loss of populations. So fire's potentially a benefit, and likewise with grazing, where it reduces biomass before the grassland becomes too thick, and potentially reduces basking opportunities for this species, or whatever the reasons might be. But at too high an intensity, or a grazing and fire combined, can be of detriment to them. Okay, slight changing habitat now. So a couple of skinks again, but these ones preferring damper habitats. They're on the wetter side, around the edges of swamps in the case of the Glossy Grass Skink as well, but both are happy in those damper, grassy or sedgy environments, and both being threatened in Victoria. But again, they're not necessarily caring as much about what the plants are. It's the structure that's important. So in the case of the swamp skink, maybe woodland overhead, but at least with trees spaced widely enough to allow sun down to the ground. Because even though they're living in damper habitats, they still have a requirement to bask. They need the sun to reach the denser ground vegetation, which is what they like. But this is an example of a couple of sites where one being dominated by largely introduced grasses and one being dominated by native sedges, and swamp skinks being found at the site that's dominated by the introduced grasses. As far as we consider, not so much, well, if at all, at the one dominated by introduced sedges. And there's no apparent reason as to why that necessarily is. Both of these are low-lying swampy sites, and at least to our eyes, the structure maybe not that dissimilar. And it's true, it's not all one way, because of course, historically, before the time when we had introduced grasses, creating this sort of a structure, swamp skinks weren't using them. So at other sites, we found that there were swamp skinks in the indigenous habitat and not in some of the weedy areas. But it's more or less evenly spread. So suggesting that they don't really care about the plant species, it's the structure that's important. Okay. And the same for the glossy grass skink. So an example of a site that's not only heavily infested by introduced grasses, mainly kikuyu and maybe sweet vernal, and there's probably phalaris, canary grass in there as well. But this site has none of its original topsoil. It's an area of fill, albeit along a creek, along a drainage line. And glossy grass skinks reinvaded, it's recolonised this site. So the group of grass skinks as a whole seem to be more capable of recolonising areas than some of our other reptiles. And it's unfortunate in one way because these tend to be the areas that get prioritised for development. So this being another example of a paddock in the southeast suburbs of Melbourne, where we know at least there were glossy grass skinks, and the rubble to a glossy grass skink, a concrete block, potentially isn't much different for it than a natural rock, even though it's considered litter. But again, this site not having much in the way of overhead canopy cover, but a dense layer of ground vegetation, mainly shorter grasses and sedges, to allow the sun down to the ground and for these skinks to bask. But they're only small, so they don't need a whole lot of cover to provide them with protection, but a preference for really dense, short, low cover close to the ground. Okay, we're just about done, but a few important points to highlight or summarise based on what I've discussed. So for frog like the growling grass frog as well, even though growling grass frog are a tree frog and they will climb vegetation to some extent, for this species and other frogs in general, wetlands with gently sloping banks are preferred, but also varying depths. So tadpoles can move through the water column. In summer, they'll tend to go deeper, where it's a bit cooler on a hot day, and in winter, for the winter breeding frogs, but also for the growling grass frogs, whose tadpoles occasionally overwinter and spend next to the whole year in a wetland, even though most of them mature or turn into a frog within the season that the eggs are laid. Providing those shallow areas allows the tadpoles to be warmer in winter. And that's important because the warmer the water, the faster the tadpoles will develop. And considering that the toadlets have a very different requirement, not permanent water at all, but shallow temporary ponds or pools. Rocks and logs are fantastic for frogs and reptiles alike, obviously to provide shelter sites and areas, in the case of reptiles, for basking and a foraging resource. But again, emphasising that the emergent and woody vegetation, trees and shrubs and taller plants shouldn't be too dense, to try and maximise the amount of sunlight that's reaching the wetland for the reasons discussed, as well as I did mention, potentially helping with the management of chytrid fungus, being a cooler adapted fungus. And for the same reason, ensuring that at least half the water surface is clear, and for the benefit of submergent plant growth, for the tadpoles' benefit as well. And so that should be a primary focus, getting plants in the water, under the water, more so than planting necessarily around the wetland or on the banks. But even then, keeping in mind what plants are appropriate, given the considerations that I've mentioned. And obviously, frogs can be a bit sensitive to chemicals as well, so being aware of that when undertaking weed control, and avoiding introducing fish into a new wetland, because in most cases, they're bad news for frogs, even though they might not necessarily affect the adults. They have an impact on the tadpoles in some cases, or the eggs. Okay, for reptiles, much of a muchness for some of these. So again, rocks and logs are important. And for those species that are ground dwelling and depend on sun reaching the ground for their basking, keeping in mind not to plant anything that's too tall and that's going to overshade the habitat. A lot of them have a preference for grasses, not just necessarily the grassland species. So considering incorporating that tussock structure, depending on the species, and importantly, being careful not to impact on weedy habitat unduly that might already be supporting populations of threatened reptiles in things like kikuyu, Chilean needlegrass, serrated tussock. Although it's good to control those things for broader ecological benefit, the important point is how you might do that, and do it gradually with structurally similar indigenous plants. And in spite of all of this, most importantly, be cautious, take a precautionary approach, consult experts and do your research first. Okay, and for any of you who are interested in where most of the information in the presentations come from, you can find it here and pursue it if you wish. Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot, David. And quite frankly, a slightly challenging presentation. But from where I am in West Gippsland, it does remind me of a very similar issue with the possibly world famous giant Gippsland earthworm, where their habitat, their preferred habitat, is slightly damp So there's been some significant changes to the way that revegetation has been constructed around areas where the giant Gippsland earthworm is known to be, to limit the amount of sort of high water drawing plantings in revegetation areas, so that, you know, large trees that will dry out ground are less favoured now in some cases. So it's a similar kind of delicate balance, if that's the right kind of word.
Yeah, exactly right. So, and for that matter, I'll only mention very quickly that it's more common in some cases to be getting giant Gippsland earthworm in agricultural areas, in paddocks, treeless, than in you know, forested areas or in revegetation for the reason that you just explained. Yeah, which is really
though you would think that the natural environment in which they grew up, they evolved, is heavily forested around this area. So clearly there used to be a sort of more of a patchwork than we now imagine. But let me get on to a couple of question. The question, if I read it correctly, how about Azolla, AZOLLA, and Azolla control on ponds? If you need to control, can you use an orange-based spray to knock the Azolla? It might be a bit of a technical issue. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, so two things. Again, the point that you're wanting ideally to keep half the water surface clear of vegetation. So being aware that Azolla tends to take over if it's left unchecked in some cases, and the same for something like duckweed. So either, some method of managing it, whether chemical or not. So I did mention that, you know, and as you'd expect, frogs, because they're taking water in through their skins as well, they've got permeable skins, and so it's not necessarily always the case, but generally can be sensitive to pollutants and to chemicals. And in the case of herbicides, something like glyphosate, it's actually more the surfactant, the binding agent, if you like, rather than the active ingredient itself. That's a problem for frogs. And so just being mindful of that. And if you are going to use any chemical around, let alone in aquatic habitat, as you know, I talk about being cautious, making sure at least that it's a chemical that's designed for that purpose. And so, yeah, some of the ones that maybe don't contain surfactants for that reason, or are otherwise recommended for using close to water. But yeah, I'm a bit, maybe unsurprisingly hesitant.
Yeah. So there was another question: how do we encourage blue tongue? How do we encourage blue tongue and skinks? They seem to like the corrugated iron sheds, and in many cases I find my woodpile, but not the venomous snakes.
So the common things, we forgot about the common things. I only told half the story in my presentation, not even. But for the backyard reptiles, or the for the more common things, similar requirements. So blue tongues need to bask as well. That's their main mode of heating themselves. Not that it's shared amongst every single of our local reptiles, but it's certainly the case in most of the ones that people are going to be getting in their gardens. And so, yes, tin's fantastic. Whatever you do for lizards, it'll be a potential benefit to snakes as well. And the lizards are a foraging resource for the snakes. So it's an added benefit for snakes. There's not really anything that you can do to separate them, to single them out, except to say that if it's a worry, create your lizard habitat or promote it further away from the house. outside the living area where it's not going to cause an issue with pets or people for that matter.
Yes, and I know it sounds a bit of a cliche, but certainly where I live, we've found generally that, I mean, we know the snakes are there, but we don't see them. They don't really sort of, they're not keen on us. They don't tend to hang about if they have alternatives. Anyway, somebody's also mentioned Azolla is great as a compost or mulch. So I guess they're suggesting sort of drag it out and mulch it rather than poison it. There was another comment also, which as a sort of a low-grade birder is a thing that I'm aware of too, is that a lot of the lizards like sewage treatment plants, lizards and frogs. Oh, it was the growling grass frog they mentioned. Yeah. Liked a particular sewage treatment plant, which also the birds like a lot too.
That's right, the Western treatment plant, Werribee. Yeah, and there's possibly that salinity influence, given where Werribee is, happening there as well. The treatment plant's right on the coast there, although it extends a bit of a way inland. But yeah, there's possibly that chemical refuge phenomenon happening at Werribee as well for growling grass frog. And a lot of the wetlands there are open and sunny also, although variation, and this is probably a good reminder to say that although some of these threatened frogs and reptiles have these requirements, for a lot of birds and mammals, it's completely different. And shrubbery and denser vegetation are important for some of those threatened species, let alone common things. So again, this is only part of the story, and it just emphasises creating a mosaic of habitats and not unduly impacting on habitat for something like growling grass frog by planting it up thickly at their expense versus benefits that it might provide for species that aren't quite as critical, but then providing that habitat for those more common species that need it in other areas that aren't going to impact on the threatened frog or reptile.
Yes, it was Bendigo's growling grass frog population at their sewage treatment plant in Bendigo. So.
Oh yeah, right, as well. Yeah, yeah. So they like treatment plants. Yeah.
Question: why are softwood logs less favourable than hardwood?
Yeah, you broke up a bit there, Paul, but I think the question was why might softwood logs be less preferable as opposed to hardwood for, providing reptile or frog habitats. So this is something that two of our Victorian experts, Nick Kleeman, who I mentioned, Peter Robertson, for species like the Swamp Skink, that's recommended, and possibly because say a pine log tends to break down maybe a bit more quickly. They may not last in the environment for as long, potentially retain a bit more moisture underneath them, as opposed to a eucalypt log. So for whatever benefit that might provide, in all honesty, you know, if you put a pine log in an area, the skink or whatever it might be may not necessarily care for as long as that log's around, and things will still use it. But I think one of the issues may be that they'll break down more quickly and be less stable in terms of the microhabitat that they provide.
And possibly whatever feeds on them, I'm guessing?
Maybe at the invertebrate level, which is obviously important for these things, because at least for the frogs and for the smaller lizards, it's the invertebrates which they're feeding on, in the main part anyway. So yeah, that may be another factor. Yeah, encouraging a greater invertebrate diversity, depending on the structure you provide, including logs, maybe.
Just shows that we probably don't know as much as we might think we would like to about a lot of these things. That seems to have exhausted the questions for the moment, David. Thanks very much. We've had a lot of comments in the chat line. Thanking you very much for what has been a very stimulating, actually, and challenging in a way talk, and I guess shows how much complexity there's that we still have to work through in a lot of these things. We've sort of charged in and mucked around with the environment without knowing what we're doing, and we're now trying to fix it in too many cases without knowing what we're doing. So thanks very much for your talk, and I think we've learned a bit. I've learned a lot.
Yeah, no worries at all. Look, I'll leave it at saying that, you know, I don't envy anyone in the position where they have to manage, you know, some of the scenarios that I showed. Yeah, it's good. My hope is that at least these things are brought to attention, and I don't blame anyone for not necessarily being familiar with these issues, because we're not only dealing with very cryptic animals, but for a group that's fairly poorly studied relative to, say, the mammals and birds as well. And so maybe, if anything, I'll leave it at a plea for further study, which is sorely needed to help us better inform management for some of these things. So if there are any poor students out there looking for a project, we can, if anything, point you in the right direction.
Actually, Dave, just on that, what's the best way people can get in contact with you if they'd like to?
Yeah, maybe. Given that I'm not personally so active on the social media, at least not yet, yeah, if they want to do via yourself, Anthony, or Paul, or otherwise, yeah, track me down, you know, either through something like LinkedIn, or my details are somewhere online maybe. But otherwise, yeah, I'd be more than happy if people wanted to get in touch, for them to do that via yourself or Paul. Otherwise, if you're happy to pass it on.
Not a problem. Cheers. Yeah.
No worries.
Yep. Just as we wind up, somebody said something about making you'd made them wish they hadn't poisoned all their blackberries.
No.
I think
no. Well, no, they're a weed of significance as well. They have to be controlled. So again, it's just a matter of how you do it.
Yeah. And the thing there, of course, is as you said, to sort of balance the structure, replace them as you go with a better structure, or a similar structure but of native species. So it's the structure, as you say, that counts.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks very much again, David, and thanks to Anthony and the First Friends of Dandenong Creek for assisting us in partnering to set all of this up. And many of the people here will be joining us again next week for our next round, and we look forward to catching them then. So thanks everyone, and good night for now.